Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ventures. I'm excited about today's episode with Malcolm Harkins and Saul Cates. In this episode, we talk about all things cybersecurity. We not only Malcolm's background and Saul's background and their thoughts about the industry in general, but we dive into principles for founders that are building companies. Like, what are the cybersecurity principles that they should be thinking about as they build their company? We also talk about just personally our security principles. It seems like there's another data breach every week out there, and there are a number of things that we can be doing to protect ourselves, and even just how to think rationally about data security and privacy for ourselves as individuals. And then finally, we briefly touch on the utopian vision for Web3. What can we learn from the history of the internet and best practices to architect a future as trust is scaled, as we have self-sovereign identity, as we control our own data and permission our data into the applications that we use around the internet. It's going to be a wild ride, and I think we have a lot to learn from cybersecurity experts like the two individuals that are my guests today. So, if you are watching this episode, you can also listen anywhere that you get your podcasts. You can just search for Ventures. And if you're listening, you can also watch by visiting wclittle.com, and there you'll see more extensive show notes to the things that we talk about today. So with that, please enjoy this conversation with Malcolm Harkins and Saul Cates. All right, Malcolm, Saul, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks, Will.
Hey, excited to be here, Will. It'll be a fun discussion for sure.
Really great to have you. So Saul, would you mind teeing up our guest?
Sure. Yeah. So as you guys have known, or you've seen probably from the last couple of episodes, that there's been a heavy cyber theme, and we've talked to a lot of people, in whether it's folks like Tony Sagar and Tony Rakowski, and sort of the standards and connecting of the different industries, sort of at that central independent layer, and we sort of talked to some specialists, and around particular types of technologies over the time, and generally just how cyber fits into the frameworks of our businesses a little bit more. But I thought it'd be awesome to have like an actual CISO who's done the job. I pretended to be a CISO. I mean, I don't mean that negatively, but I was one of those vendor CISOs. Like, I did run our CISO operations. I learned how to be a CISO so I could make sure that we knew how to interact with our audience, our customers, our actual buyers. So that journey led me into meeting a lot of different types of people, and I did a lot of roundtables, where I'd come in as the vendor, and you got 12 people around the room. They're all CISOs. Like, their job sucks. I can tell. I can read it from their questions and interactions and whatever. And I'm sitting there as like the quote executive, sort of moderating the roundtable. And this is where I met guys like Malcolm. They would pair you up with a thought leader in that sort of some And Malcolm, I think I met you in LA. I think it was the event I was at, and yeah, it was interesting because some of those rooms are awesome, and some of them are just duds. It's like, all right, no one wants to talk about anything. Okay, Malcolm was not like that, because he had a great sort of following, but just good energy, and understood how to really address the real problems and cut through the BS. So I really appreciate that about that.
And my mouth goes sometimes before my brain engages, so you never know what's going to be said, right?
And with that, I'm going to let you start talking. So there you go. Let your voice go. So introduce yourself a little bit, Malcolm, what you're up to, and what you're passionate about. 'Cause I know we're probably going to get a little bit into some fun stuff.
Yeah. So Malcolm Harkins, I'm Chief Security and Trust Officer with early stage web application security defense company, Cymatic. Prior to that, I was Chief Security and Trust Officer with Silence, which was bought by BlackBerry a couple of years ago. And prior to that, I spent my life at Intel for 24 years. My last role at Intel was Worldwide Chief Security and Privacy Officer. So I oversaw all the internal InfoSec. I saw the security development lifecycle and privacy by design for products and services. I was Director of Corporate Emergency Operations. I had physical security matrixed in, dabbled in social responsibility, public policy. So I have my fingers across a whole swath of things at Intel. And but I'm an oddball relative to many of the peers in the industry, because I'm not a technologist by background or training. economics undergraduate, MBA in finance and accounting. And when I landed at Intel, I did finance, procurement, business operations, profit and loss manager for a business unit, until I tripped my way into security when Andy Grove was frankly beating the shit out of a couple of corporate officers to deal with availability risk issues post 9/11 and Code Red and NIMDA. And Intel CIO called me up and said, Malcolm, can you run security and business continuity for me? And I'm like, why? I don't know shit about security. He's like, that's fine. I got a bunch of security geeks who don't know shit about the business. We'll teach you and you'll teach them. And I never left the space.
That's awesome, dude. That's a great way to stumble into security, because I mean, I stumbled into it too. Like I came through just like I was in tech support at QA. I like tried this, tried that, a little bit of things. I had no plan to land in security whatsoever, similar. But once I did, I just couldn't get out of it, or it kept coming back to like, I wouldn't say haunt me, but like, bring me back to like a problem I just couldn't get rid of. Like, I got to fix this. This machine is so bad. And I think we were just talking about before we got on, so like, I guess the green room, like, hey, what do we like sort of like, raging about? So I'm going to take the first question here, Will. I would love to throw this up. Malcolm. Like the thing that I think both of us have a sort of a shared passion, and then we'll probably want to be kind to our peers. But we do know that we make the money off of the flaws in the system that we're not fixing, right? What we are doing is band-aiding or putting, good process and great reactionary, frameworks and stuff, or ways to solve the problem, I guess. But we're not fixing it. We're fixing symptoms, right? I fundamentally believe that on a lot of landscapes. So, love to hear your thoughts on that, because I'm pretty sure it'll get hot.
Yeah, no, I 1,000% agree with you. In fact, I posted on LinkedIn the other day. I have this notion that I've evolved over a couple of years, that defense in depth has become expense in depth. We continue to throw money at the controlled deficiencies and Band-Aid bubblegum bailing wire when we've bought crap that doesn't work. And I look at it and I go, our sole job. So let's go to the risk equation. Risk is a function of threat, vulnerability, and consequence, right? I can't control the threat actor and threat agent, yet what do? A sophisticated actor did blah, 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 blah. Who gives a shit, right? Consequence and impact is what it is based upon your dependence on technology. Your sole responsibility, your entire job is to manage the vulnerabilities in your organization. And we've frankly done a shitty job about it. And guess what? The industry has done a shitty job in selling us stuff. And then they market the crap out of stuff, confusing business unit decision makers, confusing the CIO, and then confusing sometimes us on what's a good control and what's not a good control. And so the security industry profits from the insecurity of computing, right? At a macroeconomic level, when you make money when pain occurs, you have no macroeconomic incentive to solve the problem. And I've seen it from the people who've sold to me. I've seen it from the industry, and I've seen the compliance regimes that in some cases were instrumented by that public policy arm of the security industry perpetuate failed controls. And we need to stand up and say, not on my fucking watch, and take responsibility. And most CISOs don't do that. They stay with a go along to get along approach where there's too much risk accepted in their organizations, and they're not pounding the shit out of their solution providers, and they don't want to be held accountable. They want to put a level of Teflon on themselves and say, I need more. Well, it's time to say we need better, not more.
Yep.
So let's back up a minute. Why did it get this way? What happened? Give us a little history lesson.
Yeah. So let's go back in history. So I think there's a lot of well-intentioned people. So let's be clear on that. I think there's a ton of well-intentioned people, both on the vendor side. I think also on the practitioner side, and so I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but there's a level of complacency is the wrong word, gravitational force is probably the wrong word, but there's an inertia to get past the things that just keep you in the gravitational field that we're in, right? And that breaks down into a couple things. There's internally so the CISO has two battlefields. There's the external one, right? Threat actors and threat agents, stuff like that. And we talk about that all the time, but we focus too much on the threat actor and not focused enough on where we're vulnerable in the efficacy of control. Then on the internal battlefield, there's a battlefield of budgets, bureaucracies, and behaviors. That is the internal battlefield that you have to navigate. Now, if I look back at my Intel journey, Doug Bush, when he hired me to go run security and business continuity in IT, he knew I didn't know how to play on the external battlefield, but he knew that my background knew how to move the needle on the internal battlefield, right? And so this is where you get the business acumen, the reach, the influence, and stuff like that, that a lot of CISOs have gotten really good at that over the past number of years. Some of them are still struggling with it. But going back to the external side and the marketing side of the security industry, I think as security started blowing up 15-ish years ago and stuff like that, you had the old guard security companies that were falling behind. But what did they continue to do? They marketed the efficacy of control, and basically they were doing false advertising. The testing industry supported the false advertising. And then we bought more. And then you needed a DLP, and you needed this, and you needed that. And so we... And then the security teams are like, oh, wow, I'm getting more relevance. I'm getting more budget. I've got more people. And then as you started going from a mid-level manager to now I'm a director to senior director to VP, I'll give you a real example without naming a couple individuals. But when I left Intel to go work for Cylance, and I was talking with a bunch of peers in the Fortune 500 stuff, right, doing catch up, and there was 10 of them, give or take a little bit, that were like, why would you want to go do that? And I'm like, go do what? Leave Intel for a startup that's trying to change the world? No, not that. Why would you want to stop that many incidents? I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? They're like, well, I'm making $1.5 million a year now, and I've got budget. I'm in front of the board. I've got these other offers. And I'm like, oh my God, you're profiting from the insecurity of computing too. So there is a level of, people, the CISOs in some cases have gotten stature now, and they don't want to give it up. So you've got all of those things, and that's unfortunately true for some. It's not all, but again, when you get to the reality of it, there was a publication from National Association of Corporate Directors a year and a half ago, so late 2019, and it was a broad-based survey of corporate directors in the United States on a wide variety of questions. One of them was on cyber. 61% of board members said they would compromise on cybersecurity for a business objective. Okay, right?
Wow.
You look at ISSA surveys on the life and times of cybersecurity professionals. 50-ish% say we're somewhat vulnerable. 40+% of us say we're significantly vulnerable. So we basically say all of the organizations that we support are vulnerable. And what's your job? Going back to managing vulnerabilities. So you have boards and corporate officers and stuff like that willing to push on cybersecurity because it's not as relevant despite all of the things that's the lip service. And then you have us not managing the vulnerabilities, and then the security industry not being held accountable. You go, I don't care if you go back to the ransomware stuff in 2016, 2017, all the things we've seen. What happens? The security stock of the public companies goes up. I'm like, they've been selling shit and it failed, and their stocks rise. I'm like, economically, the incentives are so perverse. Again, former economics guy. We've got the wrong economic incentives for the security industry. We've got the wrong economic incentives for the corporate officers of companies. And then we have security folks battling all that stuff. And I think it's time we look at it differently. And even the breaches. I haven't done this, though I probably should have over the years, an investment strategy that I call BOB, buy on breach. Why? There's no long-term shareholder impact because of a breach. Temporary emotional sell-off, and including the American Association of Accounting, I saw a draft paper. They did a real study on it. I don't know if it's out yet, but it basically said, yeah, there's no long-term degradation in shareholder value because of a breach. It doesn't, look at Equifax, Target, Home Depot, Anthem. I'm like, if my job as a CEO, chairman, board is maximize shareholder value and there's no long-term impact because of a breach, why would I invest in it?
So perverse. Right? This is the part that, we were talking about systems, I think, with somebody recently, or games, and like it's one of those things where you got a reinforcement mechanism into the machine or the game or whatever you want to call it, that system, that basically makes it so that you can't break that inertia and get to the problem solving, right? You've got this sort of feeding machine that's growing the budgets of all the security, right? That's the thing that I hear quoted so often is like, the budgets are rising for security. I'm like, that's bad. That means that we're building more flaws. We're not fixing them. We're chasing more stuff, and we're putting more band-aids because obviously the last budget didn't cut it, right? Or the thing that we put in to control, or the behavior change, or the thing, right? Like, do they actually do stuff?
Yeah, and it's not to say that necessarily. There's certainly some underfunded organizations, right?
Sure.
And it's a relative ratio. So if the number of devices, the number of users, the attack surface grows, relatively speaking, the budget should rise.
Sure.
But it should be, again, I grew up in a manufacturing company. How are we proving we're getting yield off of our investment? It doesn't mean that we don't need a bigger factory that's able to produce more output, that's got to cost more, but we got to be able to prove we're getting yield out of our investments. And right now we're not getting yield out of the things we're doing in many cases.
Wow. So there's three things generally in my head, and if we don't cover any of it over the rest of our time here, that's fine. But the first one is, a lot of the audience is founders, and I'm just curious from a best practices standpoint, kind of getting it down to the weeds when it's 1, 2, 3 people. Like, what are things that organization can do to potentially stand on the shoulders of giants and not make the same mistakes? The second question, and I'm just going to outline all 3 questions right now. The second question is, all this data has been breached, the SolarWinds things. It's like every month there's another thing that freaks everybody out. And should we all assume that our tax records and everything is out there on the internet, and we're all going to, like, how should the public think about all of this? And then the third one is, which is the future vision, which is Web3, self-sovereign identity and taking control over our own data, and sort of what are the cybersecurity aspects of that. So maybe let's start in startup land. For the people that are 1, 2, 3, and they're building something technical, what are the things to think about with regard to cybersecurity?
Yeah, so for me, and I'll wrap privacy into that too, because a lot of those startups are probably collecting and processing personal data and stuff of customers or whatever. I think you need to start. I'm a big believer that culture is the strongest form of control. So as a startup leader, you need to emphasize and not just give lip service to it, actually demonstrate that security and privacy are important. Have a set of principles, bake it into your values, role model it, allow your organization to hold you personally accountable for making a mistake or being lazy on something, right? Start with those principles first, because principles are also easier to train on, right? I've had the 150, 200 page InfoSec policy document. Who's going to read that shit? Nobody. Right? And so I'm a big believer in principles. So if you think of principles like a compass, right? If I have most of my people that are building product, marketing things, managing the infrastructure and all that stuff, they understand the compass, they're going to be directionally correct. Directionally correct is going to remove a ton of slop from the system.
Always knowing where north is.
Yeah.
Right?
And then when they start getting close to where they don't know where to go, they're going to ask the question of the person who knows the longitude and latitude coordinates to go, right? So train everybody on principles, get the right security people who understand the weeds and understand what their real job is, managing vulnerability and being an independent voice and saying, not happening on my fucking watch. And holding the board, the GMs and everybody else accountable. I was having this dialogue the other day with, I get recruited all the time, right? It's kind of like everybody does. And I'm like, yeah, you probably wouldn't want me. They're like, well, anyway, so we have this dialogue and I'm like, look, for me, risk management's a contact sport. I play it like hockey and I check people into the glass. Why? Because they need to know I'm there, right? I don't use my stick the wrong way most of the time, but it's like playing hockey, right? And if you're not going to play it like a hockey game and check people into the glass, you're not doing it right. There has to be contact, right? And so you get people that recognize it's contact sport. We'll force the uncomfortable conversations. We'll be able to thread the needle between the business need and the other stuff. And again, getting back to the board, over prioritizing, a business objective to cybersecurity. I get that tactically. I've had to do that. But you can go, I need to get an early version of something out. And we're going to recognize that it's not going to proliferate too big so we can manage the risk, and then hold everybody else accountable before it really goes GA to get it buttoned up, right? And so there's a bunch of things that you can do that way that thread the needle of enabling, hence my tagline, protect to enable, right? If it's for protection's sake, you're wasting time, you're wasting money. So I would say to the startups, really start with the principles, get the right people on board, and then get somebody who is passionate about it and is not going to let it go, but can thread the needle and not impede the business and recognize that it has to be a protect to enable focus.
Anything you'd add to that, Saul?
The fact that you said principles made me grin internally. I know Will was going to say something probably like first principles are my favorite thing. Me too. I like principles. I like making sure you have an ethos. I like making sure you have a true north. I like making sure everybody on the team knows when crap happens, what happens. We all go this way, right? Or when a grenade goes on the ground, the leader better be throwing himself on that damn thing or picking it up and chucking it, right? I mean, leaders should show up when a problem shows up. That's key. And I think that's one thing that principles help with that. Good team building and good leadership. I mean, trust is the key to everything. Fortunately, unfortunately, it's just the way it is. So you have to be really good at building trust, technically, emotionally. With your business. Making sure that you have consistent results of your change. Because I think that's one thing not a lot of people talk about is change leadership and management. What do you want to call it? But you got to sometimes force that change. That uncomfortable conversation is a forcing function. It's the grenade in the room. It's the inflection point you're causing. It's like no one's leaving until we talk about this thing. And then once we're done, and I'm satisfied we at least have addressed it as a conversation, we can then get into planning mode to move next. Whatever that outcome needs to be, right? It's all about outcomes, right? And that's why I echo, like, you had a bunch of rich stuff in there, but it rallies around those really cool points, right? That makes it so easy to execute as a team, and as you're growing as a startup, I think one thing to share, that I'm looking for and I'm excited about the world is, I myself, just even personally, I'm trying to create a world where it's easier for the startups to have more of a default answer. Like, I wake up and the world is secure on this platform because somebody's done all the hard work and wired in all the things that are needed, because we've gotten that collective wisdom into a machine, right? And when you can start making a machine and build that in as base principles, first principles, whatever you want to call it, and it's taken care of for the uneducated, right? And that's a really powerful thing, because most people don't have the expertise and never will pick it up, right? But you got to be able to remove the threat and the risks and the vulnerabilities, as you said. So yeah, I guess echoes and high fives.
Yeah.
Well, one other thing to realize, though, which is true not only in the business venture but on the security side and stuff, you also can't eliminate risk, right? We can't eliminate it physically, logically, but I do believe if you're focused right, you can reduce it substantially enough that if risk manifests itself, you can mitigate it from being material or significant to your business or to your customers.
So the technical founder just starting up, cranking away, spins up a Postgres database, spins up email for their growing business, signs up for 1,000,001 different SaaS providers, starts sending out admin access sort of at will, or the opposite, like only doesn't share it with anybody, and then something happens to them, and that's a mess. What are those principles? I think you've been talking about these principles, but assuming some technical founders cranking away, maybe they don't have any training whatsoever in principles of cybersecurity. What is the short version, and where can we point people to get better information to study up on these principles?
Yeah, well, and you forgot a couple things. I'm grabbing libraries and open source shit from a bunch of different places, and I have no idea what the origin is.
There was a thread on this
from an IP perspective, or the security aspects of it.
Yes.
We've literally been bitten by this in a couple of conversations and some chats in our own internal chats here. Yes, we know
that's why I had to add that, because I've seen that too. So I think it starts with from a principal perspective, you go, hey, I'm going to have a security development lifecycle, right? I'm going to set up some level of process and procedure that gears us towards evaluating the risks in our operations and evaluating the risks in the products that we're creating and the services that we're providing. And then when you do that, there's three ways to look at risk at a macro level. There's risk to me and my business, there's risk to my customers, and then there's societal risk. I think too often we are looking at risk to ourselves, which means we're going to prioritize me over the people that I'm serving and accountable to, which is the wrong. You have to frame it in business risk, but you will end up in different answers. So think of, let's go back 30, 40 years ago now. Lee Iacocca is running the Pinto division at Ford, right? Trying to get the Pinto to market the fastest they've ever done for a car. Volkswagen's coming in hard on the low-end car market. I don't think Lee Iacocca was trying to kill people. I don't think Ford was. But guess what? They characterize the risks in risk to the business. And I think if they had simply changed the framework and the framing of the risks to people will die, they would have made a different decision.
Yes.
They had a patent on an $11 part for a safer gas tank. Right? So I think there's also, when you get to framing, in a principle, so security development lifecycle, you got all that stuff. But when you frame risk, frame it in three lenses: risk to myself, risk to my customer, risk to society. And I guarantee if you do those things, you will have a different view of what you should be doing and why you should be doing it. Those two simple things will create that compass that then you can start layering in some other principles underneath it.
I like that three. I want to make sure we go back and put that in a blog after it comes out of this. Those three things you just said there are really important, because it connects it back to the community that support the business, that support the network around it. Like, I've talked about this on other fronts, not just necessarily cyber, but like, entrepreneurship, ownership, stewardship. Like, you look at any big company or even a startup, no matter which spectrum you're on, quite often the founders don't get the rewards, or the inventor inside the machine doesn't get that payoff. I'm sure you saw that at Intel. I see it at all places. Everybody's got this problem, right? Because the game is different. It's rigged to go up, right? The money goes up. It goes up to the shareholder machine. And I'm not dissing on my shareholders. I love them all, and I have them, and I'm one too. But what I'm curious about, and what things I'm sort of seeing, is there are these I don't know, synergistics or serendipitous crossovers where you're seeing there's this need for like a new way to collaborate across industry and across our communities and across our business decision making, right? You should be able to sit down not only with your business stakeholders, but your community stakeholders, and say collectively, is this makes sense? Or if we tweak this one thing, that it literally changed the game there, and we still win. And we still win bigger because you guys like to help us when you do that, right? Those types of things are where really good leaders can help make a bigger difference. I think you hinted on some of that, but those things feel, like empowering decisions that you can start to bring in. But those three that you called out just help to bind it to that sort of community, creator or connections, I guess.
Yep.
So dope.
That's extremely helpful, and I appreciate that a lot. We'll make sure to link to things. If others have written about it, we'll do some research and try to point to things. Otherwise, let's for sure get an article up. So second meta point, which I'm sure is your standard talking point as anyone in the public asks about it, is it just seems like every month, if not every week, there's another data security. Our information's out there. How worried it seems like I've noticed over the last 20 years, we've all kind of realized people actually don't really care that their data's out there. There seems to be sort of a general, especially with younger generations. They're just like, whatever.
Here, look at my driver's license. I passed.
Right. And so just in general, like what are the talking points? What are both the genuine things to be scared and concerned about with regard to yourself and your family and your loved ones, et cetera, et cetera? What are the things that are just are overblown? How should we as sort of the general public be thinking about cybersecurity things?
Yeah, well, I think there's so much noise and headlines and stuff like that. I think there's a level of it's kind of like post 9/11, right? We're on the this tier on this alert level, and all of a sudden you're there so long, that's the new norm, right? But that's, I mean, you can take that from, I mean, heck, let's look at what's been going on with COVID, right? You get fatigue and stuff like that. And so people go, screw it. I haven't died. I haven't gotten affected. Screw the mask, whatever. Right. So I think there's human nature along that just people get complacent. And then, so you amp up the noise more, right? The media does it, the marketing machinery does it. And so, how do you combat that? I'm saturated, right, with things, and I don't know. There's a good answer other than for all of us, we just need to recognize in that noise that has created that saturation, there are some things that we should be cognizant of, and again, it's context. I mean, my personal data has been breached a gazillion times, and I had clearances with the U.S. government when the opium hack. I mean, the 90 plus pages of my personal life in the iQuip database with financial, medical records, kids stuff. I'm like, okay, I worry about it, to some extent from a personal perspective, but if I look at it practically from a risk perspective, okay, somebody gets my credit card number, stuff like that. I'm like, well, consumer protection laws in the United States, well, I'm not liable for that much. The thing that would cause the pain is rejiggering all the bills and doing all that type of stuff. Identity theft's a royal pain in the ass, right? That the real impact is the time, the confusion, if you're getting ready to buy a house. I mean, depending upon the context of those type of things, that can be very, very painful. In other cases, not so much. The other aspect of it is depending upon your own personal embarrassment level, right? Do you have pictures? Do you have videos? Do you have things that, you wouldn't want your family or your kids to see? That type of stuff is individualized. Some people don't care. Where I personally worry about it, gets much more into the proliferation of the IoT space, right? Back 10, 15 years ago, I was doing a talk at a Lloyd's of London Cyber 360 event. And Jenna, who was at DHS at the time, had just talked about, protecting the electrical grid and all that type of stuff. And I got up to talk about afterwards, and I rejiggered most of my talk after she was done. I love her perspective, and I think she was right. And she was talking about we've got to do better at protecting the grid. And I'm like, that's a problem we should have solved years ago. We're still talking about today, and frankly, we're still talking about 15 years later. But I contextualized and I said, now, again, let's look at this. Where we could do a great job of protecting the grid, then we're going to miss where the puck is going, back to a Wayne Gretzky thing. Said if I hook up my house with my HVAC, my refrigerator, all these smart things in my house, and this is again before all those started shipping, it's like, I don't need to take out the electrical grid if I want to create harm. I could just, in mass, shut down the HVAC and refrigeration capabilities in Phoenix during a 115-degree heat wave and have the same impact, or probably even worse, than taking out the electrical grid. So, this is where you have to look at it and you go cause and effect. And I think sometimes we get confused on the things that could, again, create. In the business context, I always talk about extinction events, right? What are the significant things that could kill you, right? My bank account drained, my fire alarm not going off when it should. You start getting into things that really are your own personal critical infrastructure. I think that's where as consumers and as business leaders, we need to think, because then we can get out of the worry about I worry about personal information. The leakage of that isn't necessarily lethal per se. The integrity of that data, if it gets manipulated, is more important, right? Can somebody manipulate my prescription and the dosage? Can that stuff is more critically important than heck, my financial records or photo I might have or whatever.
Yeah, because wasn't there, with regard to the proliferation of the IoT, wasn't there a hack a number of years ago where all these refrigerators had open IPs or something, and then they took down a DNS server, and like basically multiple DNS servers, and took down the internet for like half a day?
There's a bunch of things. I mean, heck, I don't know if it's still out there or not, but when I was giving a talk a couple of years ago about even non-tech companies becoming tech companies, and everybody's like, Malcolm, whatever. I think it was 2011, 2010, anyway, some way back several years ago. Oscar Mayer, right? Meat processing company, hot dogs, hamburger meat, or bacon, all that stuff. They launched a dating app called Sizzle, a dating app for bacon lovers, right? Yeah, and this was right around the time of Ashley Madison. So imagine dating app for lovers, Ashley Madison. I mean, you go, I don't know. I assume they did a good job. I don't want to poke on them, but you go, okay, if I'm, do I really want to trust some of that in a, Oscar Mayer dating app? Yeah, I don't know. So I'd say be cognizant of things like that. It could be done well, but that's also where the company side, they got to think about that stuff. The personal side has to think about it. And I think we become app hungry, right? There's again this psychological thing. If somebody is excited about something and they think it's cool and it's got this stuff, as soon as they're amped on it, they psychologically discount the risk, right? They undercall it, right? They think it's cool, right? And so I think that's it. We got to think about the psychology and sociology of these things, and then without amping up the risk thing to the way in which we do it, but just kind of trying to dial down the excitement about something so that people can be more objective and practical about the potential implications of it.
So we talked about the principles for startups. What are the principles for individuals in the modern tech age? What off the top of your head, what are the things that just you said, identify the asymmetric downside, right? Like what can kill you? Have a regular routine, I'd imagine. But what are other sort of principles for individuals out there that you'd recommend?
Well, for me, and it would be interesting to see if Saul agrees with this, I don't use password managers. It's like single point of failure, single point of compromise. And I'll tell people what I do. I'm old school. I have an old school Rolodex, and it goes in my safe. Because if I don't remember it, I'll go back and look it up, so I don't have to reset things all the time. And then the other thing for consumers on stuff is And we talk about strong passwords and all that stuff. We got to do that. The security questions, do not answer them honestly. Make some bullshit blah 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 thing up as what's your mother's maiden name? 24T, create something that's a complex thing for those security passwords. Because guess what? On your social media, your friends' social media, your family, they're gonna know all that stuff because it's all out there if you answer it honestly. Right. So never ever answer those secret questions.
Or those get compromised, right? Those back ends get compromised all the time. And that's like not even close to being protected, right? That's just the challenge questions. No one even thinks about it, right? That's critical, right? That's like so easy to manipulate. Or if that gets compromised, now it's just a litany of, I know everything about, what somebody would be challenged. And a lot of them are even self-selected. Like, what's your favorite, which one of these 20, challenging questions would you like? Everybody goes to the same 2 or 3, right? Because half of them are like really hard. Like, I don't remember the first album I bought. No, I just don't have a context for something like that. Or
I think the other thing is when you get, we all get, particularly around the holidays and stuff like that, we get the emails, 25% off, and it looks like it's coming from a retailer that you've done business with. All that stuff is highly spoofable, right? I can go to www.bestbuy.com and go get their coupon. I don't need to click on the stuff. So as much as I don't want people to be afraid of clicking on things, anything that's an advertisement, I'm skeptical of, and I just go straight to the website that I know to be the authentic one. Why? It's an extra 2 seconds, so take that time. I think the other thing is don't assume the consumer security products that you've bought are actually going to protect you. They provide some minimal protection on things that already happened. They don't actually provide real-time protection for the tweaks and stuff like that. And a lot of consumers don't get that. They go, well, and I don't want to name them all. We all know them all. But it's probably the best that you can get from a consumer perspective. But don't assume that's going to do much of any good, particularly if you're even reasonably targeted, or there's a decent organized crime that's on a website that you've landed on or sent you an email. It won't stop.
Yeah. Anything you'd add to that, Saul, with regard to sort of personal principles around security?
Yeah, I mean, it's similar. I do use password managers. I've tried them. I use them for different things, though. There's some things like my throwaway stuff. I don't mind using that. My critical stuff, it's me. And it's always in my brain, or I'll go through the challenge, recovery passwords, right? I'll go through those more sophisticated, but similar things. I don't use my real information. I never have. I don't like to. But that said, I'm looking forward to a new generation of ideas around this that I know I'm excited about. But some of these are old school ideas, like getting rid of passwords completely and to go to other ways of identifying or authorizing and authenticating yourself to a system, right? Than these goddamn passwords, which are given to us by the system. And we talk about self-sovereign identity. That's one of these things that's important to see happen in the world, and get that adoption vector takes off, because that helps us get into the authenticating against your own identity, and then using that identity against. So it removes the fact those vectors dramatically, or reduces them dramatically, because now I'm not going and providing some kind of bullshit challenge to an identity that is being managed by an external entity. I'm now using identity that I have to verify against every time against a publicly verifiable chain or something like that, depending on the architecture. Like the idea behind that just compellingly reduces that back end attack vector a lot, and gives our identities back, but it still doesn't take away completely that authentication with a thing or a thing you got to friggin' remember. That's the part that's still I'm encouraged about some things that I know are coming, but this is where I'm very that's where I find a lot of synergies in those problems. Is that the problem is passwords, but it's also the problem is the password is a byproduct of having the identity, authenticate to an identity that's in somebody else's box.
Right.
It's like these two we talked about it at the beginning and before we got on here in the green room. It's like, we keep on talking about symptoms and we keep on building products that just make money for the machine, but don't necessarily fix the freaking problem under the hood, right? Which is these are like principal problems. So I think there's all principles for the humans, but these are principal problems that we've allowed to be in the system. And Will knows this. One of my least favorite things is privilege in a system, and operating systems. That's of course a big thing for me. But you see it in a lot of other systems. I'm sure economics and others. You and your background, Malcolm. I'd love to get your perspective on the systems aspect of it, right? That sort of how is it in reinforcing the things we don't like and that we want to change, and how do we change it? I mean, is it rapid? Is it micro? And what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, look, I'll answer that, but let me tie the first thing and second thing together, right? The executives at the VC and then the personal stuff. We should all recognize that the bad actors will pivot from the home into our corporate environment, because the home is a softer target in many cases, even in bigger companies. And I've seen where executives' home systems just on a drive-by got popped. And then the hacker, organized crime folks who found that realized that John Doe was married to Jane Doe, and Jane Doe is an executive in the company, and because they own the home system, they send they intercept a real email with a photo of a kid, change and add some capabilities to the photo. Then it goes into the corporate environment, real photo, real email from the real spouse. And then the corporate system gets popped, right? Or the equivalent of corporate blackmail, because I've been able to access the cameras in the executive's home and see some things or whatever, or turn on the camera of their teenage kid because they didn't have a camera cover, and then threaten to go public with it unless some things happen. So there's different ways of ransomware, and there's different things like that home can absolutely be as substantial of an impact on the enterprise as the enterprise infrastructure. So we shouldn't forget that. The other thing on what you were talking about in terms of kind of the economics, the macro, the micro, and the systems engineering, on the podcast I had recently on Ron Ross from NIST and one of the fellows there. And love the guy to death, right? And he's really focused on systems engineering, right? And fundamentally saying, if we did systems engineering better, we would have less security issues, right? Yes. And so you could look at this fundamentally as a technology development failure, because we haven't done good systems engineering, we haven't done good QA, that then we have to have all these security overlays. So again, going back to the basics of the basics, let's practice good systems engineering. Good systems engineering with a layer added and proliferated throughout of security development lifecycle privacy by design. You did that right, we'd probably knock down 90+% of the noise that we have. Yeah. Right.
So the both of you did an amazing tee up then to our last question, our last point number 3. We all have this utopian, or at least I have this utopian vision for Web 3, which is all this data right now in Web 2 is sitting in these silos across centralization, usually in, the sort of the big 4 or 5 companies. But then also just every startup is built yet again, spinning up a database with yet again, pulling in your personal information, requiring you to have a password. The system is broken. And the utopian vision for Web 3 around identity and having control over your identity and all of the back and forth with regard to opening up the trust layers, like scaling trust in Web 3 is super exciting. But last question for the two of you, what do you see it as either potentially a dystopia, like from a cybersecurity perspective, what can go wrong here if we're not careful as we usher in the Web 3 era?
I'll go first because I want you to close out, Malcolm. You'll have probably a nice closer. I think you got to look at the entire damn spectrum. That's one of the things that I'm most concerned that most people aren't doing. Like, data is the new currency, right? So it's been used against you, to your point, like for a long damn time, since the money machine came in and figured out, oh, data, oh, it's crunchy. We can make money off this thing and add to it and target and all these great things that we did. I'm being facetious there in the great things. I mean in the scale. We learned how to do some really big scale things. We learned how to do big data. We learned a lot of stuff, but we didn't learn responsibility and accountability necessarily, right? And that's the part that I just look at that meta level, like, total mess, guys. 3.0, Web 3.0, I think we can design in security, we can design in privacy, we can create new adoption vectors, but we've got to create new communities of trust, right? This has to be done through good entrepreneurship, good leadership, good connections through the industries and governments, good, that community needs to come and connect back into the game. Because it's been disconnected forever. We have disconnected for way too long, and it's time to bring that back. So I think that I'm with you, Will. I mean, I you know me, I'm a utopian visionary. I can't stop, but I also have that. With that comes a really good contrast vision that I want to avoid at all times. Every decision I can see, like, I see the dystopia, I see the Big Brother decision here, and if we took that left instead of taking this right, or we allowed this venture or this technology to get in the wrong hands, bad things happen. The game, the system goes back to being corrupt again, right? So it's things like that I look at as well. And I'd love to hear your sort of thoughts, Malcolm. I didn't mean to go too meta, but that's how I'm thinking about it these days.
Yeah, and I'm going to try and tie all three topics together.
Ooh, nail on it.
You guys can tell me if I've been able to do it right. And I'll start with the principle that then I think will flow through all of these things, including into Web 3.0. If we go back 100 years ago, right, we had the Industrial Revolution. And what did we do? We had labor issues. We abused people. They didn't have the right rights. We proliferated spilling of chemicals. We polluted the environment, and we became hooked on it. And look at the climate change we created. The IT revolution, we've basically done the same thing. And what we should be doing is looking at data like it's a toxic element. Right? When I'm a chemist, or I go back to my Intel days and we had chemists and chemical engineers in factories and stuff like that, we had toxic chemicals to make semiconductors. Did we allow the chemists to just go mix whatever shit they wanted to together without any safety protocols? No. Right? So, we've got to look at data and the aggregation and use of it, that we might be creating something toxic to ourselves and to our IT environment and to the world and society. And if we started thinking about data as potentially being toxic, and the combinations of it creating enriched uranium, or the equivalent of a dirty bomb or something like that, and we had that as a principle, that would then probably aid our perspective in systems engineering, aid our perspective in reducing risk, and aid our perspective in architecting Web 3.0.
Brilliant.
Gold. Diamond, actually. I think it's diamond level. That was great, dude.
Where can people find you guys online? Saul?
Google me, Saul Cates. You'll find me. I'm usually LinkedIn. Probably the easiest way to find me, though.
Malcolm?
Yeah, LinkedIn, Twitter, but if you just type Malcolm and information security, you can find me very easily.
Just not in the middle. Not Malcolm in the middle. Awesome.
Gentlemen, this has been great. Really appreciate your time.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, a couple quick things before you go. Number one, I have a general newsletter where I write about technology and startups and health science and teaching people to code. And I write about a variety of different subjects that we talk about on this show. So if you go to wclittle.com, there you'll be able to subscribe, and you'll also be able to subscribe to particular topics. If you're just interested in one or a few of them, you'll be notified right when I publish new content in those areas. Number two, my partners and I at Proto Ventures have a portfolio company called Startup Rocket. If you go to startuprocket.com, There, you'll be able to receive coaching guides and customize an operations framework for you and your team and your advisors to be on the same page in terms of what is the appropriate next step for you and your entrepreneurial journey. And finally, if you wouldn't mind leaving a review anywhere that you have listened to this podcast or watched this podcast, it would be super helpful to help those who might be interested in consuming this content as well. Thank you.